The PoE Plus hat powers your Raspberry Pi 3B Plus or 4 Model B over a single Ethernet cable, meaning you can ditch the USB-C power adapter if you have the right network setup. Unfortunately, I can't recommend this new version of the hat for most users, at least not this first version, and I'll tell you why as we test everything later in this video. But first, why is PoE so special? If you have a PoE network switch or injector, you can do things like run a Raspberry Pi powered camera far away from an electrical outlet, or use Pis for industrial automation where you just have a network cable run to each Pi in your factory or warehouse. Or if you're me, you can run a rack of Raspberry Pis just using one PoE switch and plugged into a UPS and get networking and battery backup through a single cable. But why the new hat, and what's with the Plus? Well, let's dig into the history of the PoE hat and why there's a new Plus version. Before we dig in, I wanted to give a quick thanks to Volker de Boissonnier for his sponsorship on GitHub, and he asked if I could also give a special call out to Phoronix, a site that's now 17 years old and my most trusted source for testing and benchmarking so much in the Linux and open source community. People like me and Michael from Phoronix need your support to keep doing what we do, so please consider sponsoring my work using the links in the description, and also go check out and consider subscribing to Phoronix. There's a link for that too. Now, back to the video. In 2018, the Pi Foundation introduced the PoE hat for the Pi 3B Plus. That initial version had a fatal flaw. On many Pi boards, it could only supply about 200 milliwatts of power to USB before the current limiter reset. Martin Rowan first documented how plugging in almost anything besides a keyboard and mouse would trigger the Pi's overcurrent protection and switch off the USB ports. So the Pi Foundation refunded or replaced all the first version PoE hats with a new revision. The new hat has a mezzanine board that patches over the problem, and I've been running these boards for years without a problem. The power issues were solved completely for the Pi 3B Plus, but after the Pi 4 came out, people started plugging in more power-hungry devices like USB 3 SSDs, and the Pi's internals could draw even more power. This exposed a new problem. The PoE hat just can't put through all the power a fully loaded Pi 4 needs. And that's because the first PoE hat used the 802.3 AF standard. It only guarantees up to about 13 watts of power for a powered device like the Raspberry Pi. Most simple PoE devices like IP phones and security cameras are happy using less than 13 watts. But the Pi 4 is a decent general purpose computer, and people do a lot of crazy things with them, like overclock the CPU, plug in a display, and plug in multiple SSDs. Devices like SSDs consume around 3 watts each, and 2 of them together would be 6 watts. According to the Pi documentation, the Pi 4 itself, minus the USB usage, should have 9 watts available to it for stable operation. If you do the math, 3 plus 3 plus 9 equals 15, which is more than PoE can guarantee, and doesn't even include the overhead of the PoE hat's own power draw. And looking back at that power supply documentation again, the recommended PSU current capacity is 3 amps for the Pi 4 Model B. Basic PoE can't supply more than 13 watts or 2.6 amps total at 5 volts, so we're in a bit of a pickle. Now, I currently have a number of Pi 4s using the original PoE hat, and they've been online for years without a problem. But I don't overclock them, and I don't have anything plugged in via USB, so I'm well within the power requirements. But taking all that into account, the Pi Foundation just announced a new PoE Plus hat. And that Plus isn't just a marketing term, it refers to the fact that the new version of the hat supports 802.3 AT, which is known as PoE Plus. It's still backwards compatible, so it can work with older PoE switches, but if you have a newer PoE Plus switch, you can get about 25 watts through the new hat. That means you could pump 5 amps of power into the Pi through PoE Plus. Now, before you get all excited, you have to make sure you have a PoE Plus switch or injector. A lot of cheaper or older PoE devices only support the older AF standard, so you'd still only get 13 watts. Lucky for me, I do have a PoE Plus switch handy thanks to a fan of the channel who sent me this really nice HP Enterprise switch. And this switch even offers a web UI where I can check power consumption per port. And if I glance at the 2 Pis I'm currently powering with the original hats, I can see they're using about 3 to 4 watts each, which is well under the hat's maximum. But how about the new hat? It provides more power, but what are the hardware differences? Well, for starters, the new hat has this ideal diode rectifier, which replaces a slightly less efficient part from the original hat. The Pi Foundation's blog post has a thermal image showing heat dissipation under a 2.5 amp load, and in my testing, the board actually seemed to be slightly cooler than that, but still pretty hot. The second big difference is this flat transformer. The old hat used a traditional wire around a magnet transformer, but this new one is called a planar transformer. This transformer kind of turns things inside out since it has a spiral of circuit traces for a winding, and a flat magnet goes around the whole PCB. And because the PCB traces are flat and more precise than copper wire windings, they're slightly more efficient at dissipating heat. Plus, the whole transformer package can be a tiny bit shorter. The fan is also different. The old hat used a 2-pin Sunon 10,000 RPM fan, while the new one has a 3-pin ATA 12,000 RPM fan, almost identical to the case fan introduced a few months ago. The big question I have is whether the new fan sounds any better than the original hat's fan. Let's mount it up and find out. The M2.5 mounting hardware is the same you get with the original hat. I'm using some of my own 12mm screws to mount the Pi to my rack tray though. Now, there's one thing that's a bit concerning right out of the box. The screw that's pre-installed on the fan here is actually too long to fit correctly. It's a 12mm screw, and when you put on the hat, the screw pushes against the camera connector. I could ignore it and live with a little board flex, or not tighten the screws all the way. Or I could replace the screw with a 10mm screw, but I don't have one on hand. And technically I could reverse the screw and have a little jagged end sticking out at the top, but then it doesn't slide into my rack as nicely. So I handed it off to Redshirt Jeff, and he took care of the problem for me. Wait, what? I told him to take the screw off before he cut it. I don't think he's ever gonna learn. Anyways, I'm not sure how that passed the board's QA. Hopefully newer batches switch to shorter screws so this isn't a problem. And this doesn't matter to me so much, but the new hat doesn't even fit in the official Pi 4 case. I never used the hat in any enclosed case though, so for me it's not really an issue, but it is a little annoying that the old hat did fit while the new one doesn't. Another thing I disliked about the original hat's design, and it's the same on the new hat, is the fragile surface mount socket used for the PoE header connection here. I've had to resolder it on 2 of my original hats because when you pry the hat off the Pi, it can get yanked off the tiny solder joints. Most of the time though, people just stick the hat on and it never gets removed, so it's really a minor annoyance. Alright, so I have it all put together. Now let's turn it on and check how it performs. First of all, I noticed when the fan is going full blast, it gets even louder than the old hat. The new fan pushes through 2.4 cubic feet per minute compared to the older hat's 2.2 CFM, so the increased noise does also pair with slightly more cooling. For comparison, here's what the older hat sounds like at full blast. The new fan gets up to 54 decibels at close range compared to the old fan at 45. That's a pretty significant difference, and you'll definitely notice it if you're in the same room as the fan. But I do like how quiet the new fan is at low speed though. If you tweak the fan temperature settings like I mentioned in a blog post linked in the description, you can get a much more pleasant fan experience. Here are both PoE hat fans at the lowest speed. First, the new PoE Plus hat, and then the PoE hat. If you have your Pi stowed away in a rack or closet, it's not a huge issue either way, but if you're going to be near it, both fans get to be a bit annoying at full blast. I found out you can get the current the Pi is consuming using this command. It gives the current in microamps, so converting that to amps, it says the Pi is using around half an amp. At a nominal of 5 volts, that means the Pi is using a little under 3 watts at idle. That's pretty typical. But what's not typical is how much power the new PoE Plus hat uses by itself. Checking on my enterprise-grade PoE switch, I saw the port with the new PoE Plus hat using almost 6 watts. So it doubles the idle power consumption of the Pi. What about the original hat? Well, I configured the exact same Pi with the exact same microSD card and the exact same port on the switch, and tried 2 other ports too to make sure it's not a fluke. And the original PoE hat only used about 4.1 watts at idle for the Pi plus the hat. This means the PoE Plus hat consumes around 60 to 70% more power by itself than the old PoE hat. If your Pi is running full blast with USB devices plugged in, the difference isn't quite as dramatic, but if you're like me and you have some Pis running lightweight utilities like a web server or monitoring utilities, doubling the idle power consumption isn't exactly ideal. Even with the Pis shut down, the old hat consumed 2.6 watts, and the new one consumes 4.8 watts. That's a pretty significant amount of power going to waste, almost twice as much as the original PoE hat. I was also excited to really stress test the new hat, so I overclocked the Pi CPU to 2 GHz, plugged in 2 SSDs, and set up a stress test. I ran stress-ng on all 4 CPU cores, ran iPerf3 network traffic benchmarks, and wrote data to both SSDs simultaneously. The first time I ran the test, I was able to do it all, and it worked for a few minutes before I stopped it. The maximum current draw on the Pi itself was 11.2 watts, while the PoE switch was telling me the whole system was pulling over 14 watts. But I tried running the test a few more times, and every time the Pi would reset itself after a few seconds at full blast. Here's what that sounds like. Now, the same thing happened when I powered the Pi via USB-C, so the moral of this story is, if you're going to be running high-powered USB devices, use a powered USB hub, and don't plug them into the Pi 4 directly. The Pi 4's USB ports can only supply a maximum of 1.2 amps, no matter how much power the Pi itself gets. Speaking of USB, some people asked if it's possible to power the Pi via USB-C instead of over Ethernet while the hat is attached. So I plugged in USB-C power with the hat attached, and everything seemed to work just as well, at least without any hard drives plugged in. I did notice there was still power flowing through the PoE Plus hat, and I measured over 60 volts across these 2 leads. There's an Ethernet cable plugged in here, but that cable is plugged into a regular switch, and it didn't blow it up, so I guess the power's not going through Ethernet. At the same time I was doing this research, I found Martin Rowan's blog post about the new hat and saw this video clip. I was wondering why his Pi had that horrible sound, but mine didn't. Well, it turns out I just needed to plug in my hard drive. The sound that came out of my Pi was ear grating. I have a link to Martin's blog post below, so check out his investigation too. Hopefully this coil whine or whatever it is doesn't indicate a deeper issue. I haven't really had time to dig in too deep, but it's really unpleasant to hear it in person. So USB-C power does work, but if you're not going to power the Pi through Ethernet, maybe take off the hat. After all this testing, I have to say I can't recommend the new PoE Plus hat yet. Some people like overclockers who have multiple USB devices plugged in might benefit from a little extra power. I mean, the older PoE hat couldn't even run half my stress test. But for most people, the original PoE hat seems like a better option. You'll save energy and have a product that fits the Pi 4 Model B out of the box without any modifications. Both of them are $20, so price doesn't make a difference. And you can also find other PoE hat options for the Pi 2, but be careful with some of the cheaper options since they lack protections that could kill your Pi or the switch it's plugged into. In the end, I find it slightly ironic that James Adams said in the 2018 post announcing the original PoE hat's revision, and I quote, "It's embarrassing to have released a product with a bug like this, but it's a lesson well learned and we'll be improving our internal processes to prevent a recurrence." There are definitely similar teething problems with this next-gen PoE Plus hat, and hopefully QA for the next board's launch is better. I should note that I was never contacted about the PoE Plus board prior to its release, nor was Martin, who first identified some of those original PoE hat problems, and I'm not sure how many people outside the Pi Foundation tested it before release. A wider real-world testing program would have probably identified these issues. Hey, it's Jeff. So this is the morning that I'm posting this video, and I actually just got a response back from the Raspberry Pi Foundation to an email that I sent with some of the questions that I had after making this video, and I wanted to mention them here just because I think that'll head off some questions about it. First of all, with USB-C, the back power issue shouldn't cause any problems, but apparently it's not a supported use case according to the Pi Foundation. That's not mentioned right now in the documentation, so hopefully they can add that in. But if you're going to power it from USB-C, like I said earlier, pop off the hat. Also, they did mention that the new hat does use more power. They said that that is the case, especially if the PoE power supply you're using is close to 50 volts. And if you need to use less power, their recommendation was sticking with the original PoE hat. So for me, like I said earlier, I think that's the better option. And for a lot of people that are using the Pi, not to do overclocking or have lots of USB devices plugged in, it might still be the best option. Also, I mentioned the fan noise, and they said that the new fan does have also a longer lifetime, and it's rated for higher temperatures, so the bearings that it has are a little bit louder at full blast. But like I mentioned, it is actually quieter at the low setting, which is nice. So in the end, even with that new information, I'm going to stick by my findings and my recommendation, But this got me thinking that maybe the hat would be perfect for like a Pi 4B plus revision that lifted the USB current or had a higher clock speed, or maybe even a Pi 5 someday. And I don't have any idea if either of those things are actually going to happen, so that's just my speculation. But it seems like the PoE Plus hat is unnecessary overkill for a lot of the Raspberry Pi 4 use cases. Anyways, back to the pre-recorded video. I'll dive more into power over Ethernet in general in a future video, so make sure you're subscribed. In the meantime, check out some of the videos and resources linked below. Until next time, I'm Jeff Geerling. And more precise, flat. Apparently I'm still going through puberty. That was not the best way to do that, so I'm going to try it again. Some people asked if it's power, I sure plugged in that power. There's an Ethernet cable plugged in here, crud. There's an Ethernet cable plugged in this little clip, but moral of the story, don't just start ad-libbing in the middle of a sentence that I wrote out already. But for most people, the original PoE, somebody just texted me. I finally got that paragraph and then DHL texts me.